Late Sunday morning, investigators stood outside Nancy Guthrie's home as the sheriff delivered a sentence that immediately changed the direction of the case. She did not leave that home on foot. At first, many people assumed this was another missing persons case. An elderly woman disappears overnight. Family members panic. Search teams mobilize. But behind the scenes, investigators were already treating the property very differently. According to Sheriff Chris Nanos, what deputies found inside and outside the home was disturbing enough that homicide investigators were called almost immediately. And then came another detail that raised even more questions. DNA evidence discovered inside the residence was rushed out for rapid testing after local machines were reportedly unavailable. The samples had to be transported to Phoenix, while detectives worked two investigations at the same time: a search and rescue operation in public, and a criminal investigation quietly unfolding in the background. Within hours, the tone had changed completely. Nancy's medication was still inside the house. Her phone was still there. Her vehicle remained untouched in the garage. Investigators said they believed she had been removed from the home against her will. And perhaps most chilling of all, search and rescue efforts were quickly pushed aside, as law enforcement focused more heavily on the possibility that a crime had already occurred. So here's the question that continues to haunt this case. What exactly did investigators see inside that house that made experienced detectives pivot so fast toward homicide? Before we go further, tell me this in the comments. What was the very first detail that made you realize this might not be a normal missing persons case? Because according to investigators, that wasn't even the strangest part. The last confirmed moments of Nancy Guthrie's ordinary routine now sit at the center of an investigation that has only grown more unsettling with time. According to investigators, Nancy was dropped off at her home by a family member on Saturday evening. Nothing about the night initially appeared unusual. She was reportedly preparing for bed, settling into the familiar rhythm of a quiet weekend evening. Investigators later said she had begun taking her nightly medication, part of a medical routine that people close to her understood was extremely important. Sheriff Chris Nanos would later reveal that going too long without that medication could become life-threatening. And because of physical limitations, Nancy was not believed capable of traveling very far on her own. Reports suggested she could not comfortably walk long distances without assistance. At that point, there was no public indication of danger. No emergency calls, no reports of forced entry, no sign that anything extraordinary was about to happen inside that house before sunrise. But by Sunday morning, the entire situation had changed. The first alarm reportedly came when Nancy failed to appear for church services. People who knew her understood that absence mattered. Someone from the church contacted family members, and relatives went to the home to check on her themselves before law enforcement was ever called. What they found immediately disturbed them. Nancy was gone, but her cell phone was still inside the house. Her vehicle was still parked in the garage. And perhaps most concerning of all, her medication appeared to have been left behind. For investigators, those details mattered because they suggested interruption. A person planning to leave voluntarily would normally take at least some of those essentials with them. Family members spent nearly an hour searching the property and making calls before finally dialing 911. That timeline would later become important because investigators were trying to reconstruct every possible minute between Nancy's last known sighting and the arrival of deputies. Then came the sheriff's comments about the condition of the home itself. In interviews, Sheriff Nanos repeatedly avoided describing exactly what investigators discovered inside and outside the residence. But he did say the scene contained unusual and suspicious indicators almost immediately. enough to make experienced investigators believe they could not treat the case as a standard missing persons report. He declined to discuss specifics. No confirmation about footprints, no confirmation about blood. No explanation about whether items inside the home had been moved or disturbed. Each time reporters pressed for details, the answer stayed almost identical. There were things only the intruder would know, and detectives wanted to protect that information. That silence has only intensified public speculation ever since. Because whatever deputies encountered that morning changed the direction of the investigation within hours. Search and rescue teams were still preparing operations, but homicide investigators had already been called to the scene. And that raises the question detectives still refuse to answer publicly. What exactly did they see inside that house that convinced them so quickly that Nancy Guthrie had not disappeared voluntarily? Within hours, more than 100 law enforcement vehicles surrounded the property. From the outside, the early hours of the investigation looked like a standard missing persons response. Search teams mobilized. Deputies canvassed the surrounding area. Aircraft, drones, canine units, and ground crews were all brought in as authorities tried to determine whether Nancy Guthrie had somehow wandered away from her home during the night. But behind that public operation, investigators were already moving in a very different direction. Sheriff Chris Nanos later explained that 2 investigative tracks were launched almost immediately. One focused on search and rescue. The other focused on the possibility that a crime had already occurred. And according to the sheriff, it did not take long for detectives to lean heavily toward the second explanation. What changed things so quickly was not one dramatic piece of evidence. There was no public announcement of shattered windows, no confirmed signs of a violent struggle, no single cinematic clue that instantly solved the mystery. Instead, investigators appeared to be reacting to a collection of smaller inconsistencies that, taken together, stopped making sense as a voluntary disappearance. Nancy's medication remained inside the house. Her phone had been left behind. Her vehicle was still parked in the garage. Detectives also knew about her physical limitations and reportedly believed she could not travel far on foot without assistance. Then came the sheriff's most direct statement. "We believe she was forced out of her home." At another point, he clarified further, saying investigators did not believe Nancy had walked over the threshold on her own. Whether she physically walked out under coercion or was carried remained unknown. But authorities repeatedly emphasized the same conclusion. She left against her will. That language mattered. Law enforcement agencies are typically careful with public wording during active investigations, especially in the early stages. Yet here, the sheriff was openly describing the situation in terms that strongly suggested abduction. And that helps explain why homicide investigators were deployed so early. In interviews, Sheriff Nanos described receiving updates from deputies and investigators who had already begun processing the scene. The information coming back was concerning enough that he reportedly felt waiting too long could cost investigators valuable time if a criminal act had in fact occurred. So homicide personnel were brought in while search teams were still organizing operations nearby. That overlap created one of the strangest dynamics in the entire case. Publicly, authorities could not yet abandon the possibility that Nancy was alive somewhere nearby. But internally, many investigative decisions already reflected the belief that something much darker had happened inside that house overnight. And there was another complication. If investigators believed Nancy had been removed from the property using a vehicle, then logically, some trace of that vehicle should have existed. Tire impressions, disturbed gravel, mud patterns, something. But according to the sheriff, the driveway and surrounding surface conditions may not have preserved that kind of evidence at all. The area reportedly lacked the soft terrain that normally captures clear tire marks. No snow, no wet dirt, no deep gravel. Almost a paved-like surface that could allow a vehicle to enter and leave without leaving obvious impressions behind, which creates an unsettling possibility. The vehicle investigators believe may have carried Nancy away could have disappeared without leaving any visible forensic trace by the time daylight arrived. And that raises another question that detectives still have not answered publicly. If someone entered that property during the night, how much evidence did they actually leave behind inside the house itself? Because according to investigators, the environment may have erased the most important evidence before daylight even arrived. As public attention intensified, one phrase began dominating coverage of the case more than any other: DNA evidence. But the sheriff's actual wording was far more careful than many headlines suggested. During interviews, Sheriff Chris Nanos stated that investigators believed they had located DNA evidence inside the home, and that the material had already been submitted for rapid testing. He did not say the DNA belonged to a suspect. He did not say there was a match. And he never publicly described exactly where inside the residence the evidence had been discovered. That distinction matters. DNA can become one of the most powerful tools in a criminal investigation, but by itself, it rarely provides instant answers. A DNA profile may identify a person, but investigators still have to determine why that DNA was present, when it was left behind, and whether it actually connects to a crime. In a home where family members, visitors, workers, and acquaintances may have entered over time, separating meaningful evidence from ordinary contamination can become incredibly complicated. Still, investigators moved quickly. According to the sheriff, local rapid DNA testing equipment was reportedly unavailable, forcing authorities to transport evidence to Phoenix for processing. Once analyzed, any usable profile could then be entered into CODIS, the national DNA database used by law enforcement agencies across the country. Additional private laboratory services were also mentioned as part of what the sheriff described as rush orders, with turnaround times potentially shortened to just a few days. The urgency reflected the growing concerns surrounding Nancy's condition. Investigators already knew her medication had apparently been left behind, and every passing hour mattered. But almost as revealing as what authorities said publicly was what they refused to discuss. Reporters repeatedly pressed investigators about specific details inside the home. Were there footprints? Was there blood? Was bedding missing? Did detectives identify a forced entry point? Each question was met with some version of the same answer. Authorities would not release information known only to the intruder. That strategy serves an important investigative purpose. In major criminal cases, detectives often protect certain details so they can later evaluate confessions, witness statements, or tips. If someone claims involvement but cannot describe the undisclosed elements of the scene accurately, investigators immediately know something is wrong. But if a suspect reveals details that were never made public, that information can become critically important. And in this case, investigators appeared determined to preserve that advantage. The sheriff's refusals also fueled another possibility quietly hanging over the investigation. Detectives may believe the person responsible was familiar with the home itself. Not necessarily a stranger randomly passing through, but someone who understood the environment well enough to move quickly, avoid attracting attention, and leave very little visible evidence behind. Then investigators encountered another problem entirely: cameras. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that exterior cameras existed at the property, though he stopped short of confirming whether cameras were installed inside the house. Under normal circumstances, Surveillance footage might have immediately answered key questions: whether someone approached the property, what time movement occurred, or whether a vehicle entered the driveway during the night. But according to the sheriff, investigators initially faced difficulties accessing the footage. At the time of the interview, authorities were still working with technology companies and manufacturers to retrieve or unlock potential recordings. Investigators reportedly did not yet know whether footage had been stored locally, uploaded to cloud servers, or preserved in another format requiring technical assistance. That uncertainty created a dangerous gap in the timeline during the earliest and most critical phase of the case. And that missing window may matter more than almost anything else investigators are currently analyzing. Did the cameras capture a vehicle approaching the home? Did they record movement near the driveway? Did someone disable or avoid them entirely? Detectives have never publicly answered those questions, which only deepened speculation surrounding another possibility. Was the person responsible someone Nancy already knew? Someone who understood the property, the routines, and perhaps even the cameras themselves. For now, investigators continue withholding key details while forensic testing moves forward behind the scenes. But as the case expanded beyond a local missing persons investigation into something far more serious, detectives encountered another mystery that complicated everything even further. There were no ransom demands. In many kidnapping investigations, investigators look for one thing almost immediately: communication. A ransom demand, a threatening message, a phone call, something. But in Nancy Guthrie's case, authorities publicly stated that none of those things appeared to exist. No ransom requests were reported. No known threats had been made public. No one contacted the family demanding money or instructions. And the longer that silence continued, the more investigators were forced to confront a possibility far more disturbing than a financially motivated abduction. Because if this was not about money, then what was it about? That question changed the emotional gravity of the case entirely. The disappearance of an elderly woman from inside her own home already carried a deeply unsettling quality. People expect danger in isolated parking lots, dark highways, unfamiliar places. But a private residence, late at night, after an ordinary evening routine, feels different. It touches something more personal. The idea that someone could vanish from the place where they should have been safest is exactly the kind of case that stays with communities long after headlines fade. And investigators knew another factor made the situation even more urgent. Nancy reportedly depended on daily medication. Sheriff Chris Nanos stated publicly that going roughly 24 hours without it could potentially become fatal. Detectives believed the medication had been left behind inside the house when she disappeared. That detail transformed the timeline into something much more dangerous. Every hour now mattered in two different ways. Investigators were racing not only to identify what happened inside the home, but also against the possibility that Nancy herself was running out of time physically. The case stopped feeling like a standard missing persons search and began resembling a narrowing clock. And in many ways, that may explain the extraordinary scale of the early response. Law enforcement units spread through the neighborhood almost immediately. Deputies went door to door, asking residents about unfamiliar vehicles, unusual sounds, surveillance footage, or anything that seemed out of place overnight. Detectives requested access to ring cameras and other private security systems throughout the area, hoping to reconstruct movement near the property during the missing hours investigators still could not fully explain. License plate reader systems were reportedly reviewed. Digital preservation requests were sent out. Federal agencies became involved. The FBI assisted alongside local and state investigators, while technology companies, including Apple and Google, were mentioned as cooperating with authorities, as detectives searched for electronic evidence that might help narrow the timeline. And through all of it, one uncomfortable reality remained constant. There was still no clear explanation for motive. No known robbery, no known ransom, no publicly identified suspect. Just an empty house, suspicious circumstances, and a growing sense that investigators believed they were looking at something intentional. The sheriff also spoke publicly about Savannah Guthrie's involvement in helping investigators understand her mother's routines and habits. According to him, she worked closely with detectives, providing details about the home, daily schedules, and the subtle patterns investigators often rely on to recognize when something inside a crime scene feels wrong. In interviews, he described her as sharp as a tack, emphasizing how seriously the family was working alongside authorities behind the scenes. But even with national media attention, expanding forensic work, federal assistance, digital evidence requests, and massive search operations, the investigation continued, generating more questions than answers. And perhaps that is what makes the case so unsettling to so many people following it. Not just the possibility that Nancy Guthrie may have been taken against her will, but the fact that investigators appeared to recognize almost immediately that something criminal had happened. And yet days later, so much still remained unknown. So let me ask you this. What shocked you most about this case so far? The missing medication? The DNA evidence? Or the fact investigators believed it was criminal almost immediately? Because despite the growing number of agencies involved, despite the technology, despite the forensic testing, the mystery somehow only seemed to deepen. But if so many agencies became involved so quickly, why does the case still feel so unresolved? One of the hardest things for the public to accept in cases like this is the gap between what investigators know and what they are willing to say out loud. From the outside, silence can feel like failure. A lack of updates often creates the impression that an investigation has stalled, that detectives are lost, or that crucial evidence never existed in the first place. But major investigations rarely unfold publicly in real time. In fact, many of the most important developments happen quietly, behind closed doors, long before the public ever hears about them. And that appears to be exactly what is happening here. Throughout interviews, Sheriff Chris Nanos repeatedly returned to one central idea. There are details about the home that only the intruder would know. He declined to discuss specific forensic findings, refused to describe certain conditions inside the residence, and avoided confirming several rumors that quickly spread online. To some viewers, that secrecy felt frustrating. But from an investigative standpoint, it serves a critical purpose. False confessions happen more often than many people realize. In high-profile disappearances, investigators can receive floods of tips, fabricated witness accounts, and even people falsely claiming involvement for attention or notoriety. Protected details become a filter. If someone eventually reveals information never released publicly, detectives can compare those statements against the actual crime scene evidence. That is why investigators often guard seemingly small details so aggressively. And in this case, the unanswered questions may be more important than the confirmed facts. What exactly triggered such an immediate criminal response? What evidence inside the home suggested Nancy did not leave voluntarily? And what, if anything, did the DNA evidence actually reveal after testing began? Because another reality of modern investigations is that forensic evidence rarely produces instant clarity the way television dramas suggest. DNA testing can take days, weeks, or even longer, depending on sample quality and comparison requirements. Digital evidence retrieval can become equally complicated, especially when cloud systems, locked accounts, third-party companies, or overwritten surveillance data are involved. Even retrieving footage from security cameras is not always simple. Investigators may need warrants, technical cooperation, password recovery, or back-end server access before they can fully reconstruct a timeline. And in the earliest hours of an investigation, those delays matter. In many major cases, the first 48 hours are considered the most critical. Witness memories begin fading. Digital trails disappear. Surveillance footage gets overwritten. Environmental evidence degrades. Investigators know that every hour increases the difficulty of separating useful facts from background noise, which may help explain the intensity of the early response in Nancy Guthrie's case. At the same time, authorities have also emphasized something else repeatedly: the family's cooperation. Sheriff Nanos specifically praised Savannah Guthrie for the role she played in assisting investigators, describing her publicly as sharp as a tack. According to him, she helped detectives understand her mother's routines, habits, and the subtle details of daily life that often become crucial during investigative reconstruction. That kind of cooperation matters more than many people realize. Families often help investigators identify what feels normal versus what feels deeply out of place inside a home. A moved object, an unusual light left on, a disrupted routine. Sometimes the smallest inconsistency becomes the thread detectives continue pulling for weeks afterward. But there is still one possibility hanging quietly over the entire investigation. What happens if the DNA evidence returns no meaningful match at all? No suspect in CODIS, no clear forensic hit, no identifiable outsider connected to the scene. If that happens, investigators may be forced to rely even more heavily on timelines, digital movement, witness interviews, behavioral analysis, and whatever details inside the home remain known only to detectives themselves. And that may be why public updates in cases like this often become less dramatic over time. Not because investigators stopped working, not because the case disappeared, but because detectives sometimes reach the stage where solving the mystery depends less on public attention and more on narrowing inward, piece by piece, detail by detail, until one inconsistency finally breaks the entire case open. Tonight, the house where Nancy Guthrie disappeared still sits at the center of a mystery investigators have not fully explained. Inside, some of the smallest details remain the most haunting. Her medication reportedly still there. Her phone left behind. Her vehicle untouched in the garage, exactly where it should have been if the night had ended normally. But according to investigators, it did not end normally. Somewhere between an ordinary Saturday evening and Sunday morning, something happened inside that home that changed the direction of the investigation almost immediately. Detectives believed early on that Nancy did not leave voluntarily. DNA evidence was rushed for testing. Homicide investigators arrived quickly. Exterior cameras may hold critical answers investigators still have not fully discussed publicly. And yet, despite all the technology, the forensic testing, the interviews, and the massive law enforcement response, the case still feels suspended in an uncomfortable silence. No confirmed suspect, no public explanation of motive, no clear account of what happened inside the house that night. Only fragments. A sheriff carefully choosing his words. A family still searching for answers. And a home that may contain details detectives continue protecting from the public because they believe those details matter more than anyone realizes. Cases like this stay with people because they disrupt something fundamental: The belief that home is predictable, safe, ordinary. If you hope this family gets answers, leave a comment below as a tribute to Nancy and everyone still waiting for someone to come home. Because some disappearances leave behind noise, others leave behind silence.